We are on. Pass it to you, Danny.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Partially Examined Life's Aftershow broadcast. It's an exciting one, and there's a lot to talk about, and there are a lot of people here already who I want to introduce. We have a very special guest. Rebecca is joining us. I just got a little bit of a background on Rebecca, but I think it wouldn't do me justice to repeat it. It would be better to hear it from you yourself. Tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. So I am a tutor at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. I wrote a dissertation on Aristotle's De Anima, and I have some published and forthcoming publications on it.
Can you not? An expert, I think we could say.
No. I reject that word fully. And I reject it as part of who I am and part of where I teach and where we read these books, and nobody's an expert. I just have read this book a lot.
I'll tell you the truth. I agree with the last part of what you said. Nobody's really an expert. And I've been saying this for a long time. I don't think anybody's an expert on anything. And the older I get, the more I believe that.
I think I'm inclined to mistrust anybody who says they're an expert on something.
That's right. I'm an expert on experts. There are none. Where does that leave you? If you don't trust me, then there are experts. We have Wes joining us. Wes, a celebrity from the podcast itself, one of the voices that we've come to know and love. How you doing, Wes? What's going on?
Pretty good. I think calling me a celebrity is like calling anyone an expert under...
I hope everybody rejects every title I give them as we go. So what's been new in your life? It's been a long time since an after show. A lot's got to have happened. Let's get to that right away.
For me?
Yeah.
I'm going to Mexico tomorrow for a week, so that's the...
God, he's involved in the drug trade. I knew it.
Yeah. Part-time celebrity, part-time drug dealer.
All these philosophy guys also work for the cartel.
There's got to be a way, yeah. It's got to be a way to make some money. So
where in Mexico are you going?
Mazatlan.
Okay, and why?
There's a resort there.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
So, my sister won a trip. I'm going with two of my sisters. And,
good look, you won a trip. You won it. Fantastic.
Yeah.
And we wish you a wonderful trip to Mexico.
Thank you very much.
We might ask you more about that as the show goes. We have Nick joining us. Nick, how are you, and where are you coming to us from?
Hey, I'm very good. I'm from British Columbia, Canada. Maybe the only Canadian here. Just Canada. It's just the big landmass above you. And I just am one of the many people who helps to edit the podcast. Yeah.
Well, you're an angel. We need people like you, the men behind the scene that make it so everyone else can enjoy what's going on. And I wouldn't be objected to everyone giving you a quick round of applause. I'll start
I need to modestly reject the angel title.
Next, we go to Michael. Michael, how are you, Michael?
I'm fine, thank you very much. What would you like to know? I'm currently in Gloucestershire in England at night.
What's the weather like there?
What's the weather like there? Warm and nightly.
Not
it's very, very overcast with a dark shade of night.
Very good. And what do you do there in the UK?
At the moment, I teach. I travel and I teach.
What do you teach?
Computer science and applied topics in computer science.
Very interesting. And where do you travel?
Mostly around the UK. Mostly around the south of the UK.
Have you ever been to British Columbia, Canada?
No.
You should come. The climate's very English. It's raining right now.
Have you ever been to Macatera, Mexico?
No, but the phrase "I've won a trip" is very American. Sounds like the beginning of Fifth Element or something, with a card coming from a slot and there's a radio show and someone's won a trip. Doesn't happen here. That's just not a thing. It's interesting.
I've never won a trip either. Anytime I ever win a trip, it's a scam phone call. They go, you've won a cruise. I immediately hang up with them. Either I'm the luckiest guy in the world that I keep winning cruises, or it's a scam. The first time I thought about indulging them, I'm glad I didn't. Anyway, good crowd, and I'm sure it'll build up as we go into an even larger crowd, but let's get this party starting. We're talking about Aristotle's The Anima, correct?
The Anima.
Are we all on board here?
Yes.
A fascinating show, and a show that I found a little bit hard to wrap my mind around. Talking about, I think listening to Aristotle talk about the news for a long time made me almost want to use one. Wes, I had a hard time understanding it. But let's start with a few things.
We may not have done the best job on this one explaining it. So it's good we have a quote unquote non-expert.
I'm not going to blame you guys, but let's start with I took some notes just to get this conversation started. Imagination cannot be opinion and sensation. That's the first thing I wanted to discuss. Imagination cannot be opinion and sensation. Then what is he saying exactly that it is? And Rebecca, this question is to you as well.
It's to me as well as other people, or it's to me as well as other questions will be?
Well, every question is to you.
Oh, okay.
Every question's to everyone.
You could kind of clarify this for me, and then people can jump in from there.
Okay. Well, I guess, I would start by saying that for Aristotle, maybe one of the clearer things he says about imagination is that it's a motion that follows from sense perception, but that you can have sense perception and not yet have imagination.
I can't say that I'm less lost.
So, you have dogs.
Yes.
I've heard you talk about your dogs. So, maybe dogs fall into a middle category. We're not sure. But, for example, Aristotle thinks that some animals have sense perception, but that they don't go further and imagine things. So that they might be able to, say, sense the thing, let's say just by touch, right? They can feel that there's something cold or warm in front of them. But short of that thing being directly in front of them, they couldn't, say, imagine the warm thing that was once there or that was just there. And that sounds a bit like memory, and of course it's connected to that. But they also couldn't call to mind suddenly, somebody mentioned on the show when your dog might imagine the other dog that was once in the yard. There are some animals that can't do that. They can only sense directly what's right in front of them.
Right.
Okay.
I have a question concerning that. So does Aristotle then have anything to say about, he seems pretty, for his time, progressive about the fact that, like, souls might not just be a concept relegated to people. Like, animals have souls. But he also says, like some animals just can only have an animal consciousness, that they only touch things to perceive them. Like, does he get into? I skimmed my copy of the book after reading the podcast, so I'm not sure. Like, does he make any distinction or try to schematize that? Like, oh, maybe there are animal, like, lower souls.
Is this for me as well?
I guess everyone else is.
I actually think that's the best way to approach this text, is by sort of asking yourself, okay, where are we and what kind of soul does the being he's talking about right now have? So certainly animals have souls. They have souls capable of sensation. And that means that they already also have nutritive souls. So Aristotle thinks, right, there are perhaps... we can talk about this later, but three basic kinds of soul: nutritive, sensitive, and intellectual souls.
Right.
To be alive means to have a nutritive soul. You can also then add to that a sensitive soul. And then you could add to that an intellectual soul. So the things that have intellectual souls are probably limited to human beings. But then there's the broadest, there's certainly more in the other two categories. All plants, all animals have souls. The world is animate for Aristotle. It's filled with animate beings.
Right.
It's interesting how he categorizes these souls. He breaks down these souls, and not that it's one kind of soul that's deficient in this or that. It's that there are separate souls.
What do you mean? Sorry.
Like, I guess you're saying that, you know, it's... Go ahead.
Who's talking? I can see Erik.
I think Erik might be having technical difficulties still.
I'm not hearing you there, Erik.
Can I be heard?
Erik, you're on mute.
For me. Go about your business. Okay. Okay.
All right. Erik says, "Go about your business." That's what we hear. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hello.
And Wes, would you like to chime in on the question of different souls? If Aristotle is specifically saying there are different categories of soul, and some have multiple soul, or is he saying there's one kind of soul, but it can be deficient in this or that?
Well, I think Rebecca explained it very well. I'm not sure you would talk about deficiencies, but I think you know, as Rebecca was explaining, there's you could think of these as functions or powers or potentialities that souls have or don't have. So an animal soul will have the nutritive power, but it obviously won't. Sorry, it'll have the nutritive and the sensitive powers, but it won't have the intellectual powers. So I don't know if we want to call it, say, deficiencies in the sense it's lacking you know,
right.
A plant soul will be lacking in the sensitive and intellectual powers. You know, if you want to call that.
According to Aristotle, can a creature have more than one soul or being?
No.
No, one soul.
It's one soul.
One soul. So he actually likens it, right, at one point to the way that the souls, I think of them as nested, one in the other. And his analogy is to geometric figures. So that in any, in the quadrilateral, we can divide it up and we see that there are triangles there. So, and then as you grow your figure, you might also see a square within a larger sided figure. But you'd have to break it up to see that. In some ways, the question of soul is what kind of being is this, right? If it's a plant, one of the ways we know that it's a plant is by saying, well, it does these things and it engages in these activities, and the reason why it does that is because it has this kind of soul. So what kinds of beings do we see in the world? We see plants, we see animals, we see human beings, and we see a variety among those. We see different kinds of plants, we see different kinds of animals.
He also talks about the souls being eternal, right? We talked first. There's a discussion about the soul as a whole is a form, and it seemed like there was a rejection of that idea because it didn't need to take a form itself. Am I correct in how I understood that? Because I think Aristotle was saying the soul is an eternal thing, right?
Well, I don't think it's going to turn out to be eternal, although he will think of nous or intellect as something that perhaps can survive the destruction of the body. But in general, the soul is not something that's going to survive the destruction of the body because it's closely tied to the body. It is actually the form. An organized body is the matter in this sense. So there's a close connection where, which scholars sometimes call hylomorphism, where the soul and the body are inseparable, and the soul is the form of the body.
This is hylomorphism, is the word for that?
Yeah, it just means matter and form. Hylo, matter, and...
Yeah. Like, for me, that's what I'm more familiar with in Aristotle. And it's like, it seems like this book is kind of his applying that. Like, he's already formalized, that's his sort of theory to attack things with. It seems like then he just attacks, like, animation of things with that same, you know, because earlier he's talking about, you know, what is the thisness of something, and then he's like, well, okay, what about mind? So it just kind of struck me today that maybe it's kind of like it's like this is his scientific approach, right? And it's not necessarily particular to trying to figure out how a mind works, but this is how he's been trying to figure out how, like, most physical things function.
Can anyone hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Welcome.
Yeah. Welcome. It's nice to
You both look and sound much better.
I'm out of the basement. I'm out away from the Linux. Everything's better. But in De Anima, I couldn't find any point where he talks about the connection of nous or mind to the psyche or soul that is particular to the human being. Like he talks about some of the higher faculties, like foresight, if I'm not mistaken, but that mark out sort of us, I guess, and that things like plants or dogs don't have, and we all have souls all the way through, but how nous, how mind, the creative mind that allows you to make things or design a boat, he doesn't seem to talk about that there. I just wonder if anyone knows, in any other text does he approach that?
Like
if I'm right, or you? If you
I was just gonna say, like, a creative aspect is what you're asking.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess I wonder if he talks about the I think it's called nous poeticos, right, in 3.5, and I'm wondering if that's where you're getting this notion of making, that if the soul makes things, that which I don't think that's entirely what he means there, or maybe I just not following the question.
I just know De Anima is just fascinating for its discussion of what a soul is. I'm just trying to think out in somewhere in the Aristotle corpus. I'm sorry to go outside the text, but where he talks about that how humans specifically have this ability to think, to access the logos or whatever. But you're right; it is pointing way outside the text that's in front of us.
Well, I mean, I also one thing. I mean, I think Nick made this point earlier. In some ways, this is not a treatise on human beings. It's
Correct.
just not. It's a treatise on living things and what is the difference between living things and non-living things, and among living things, what are the different varieties of living things. And as I was saying before, there's a whole variety of plants. There's a whole variety of animals. It looks like maybe there's only one kind of living thing that has nous, and he doesn't spend an enormous amount of time in this treatise on it, even though that's where so much of the attention, I think perhaps wrongly, has been given when we read this text.
If I could, I'm curious about my understanding of this. So what I've tried to map it onto is, and I think this is a recurring issue that sort of recurs through metaphysics, and that sort of relationship between the particulars and the forms or the properties that emerge out of the interaction between particulars, or between matter, the matter arising out of matter, if you like. So, or we could just call it emergence. So the way I'm thinking about it is this: that a form is something like how he is trying to capture the fact that individual things combine together to produce wholes that have different properties than their individual parts. So he's saying, he's trying to attach those kind of emergent properties to a form, and then so that gives us the soul. The soul is like then all that living thing that happens in virtue of the fact that we're composed of organs that, when they're joined together, do something. What do? They do the soul. And then, if you think of the mind, or this intellectual part of the mind, which he seems to call the form of forms. Now, I was thinking about that. I thought, well, if I was thinking about thoughts, how would I attach thoughts to the body? Well, they're not a chemical process or a biochemical process in the way that the soul is. If I'm taking this modern view of it, in the sense that if light reacts with my nervous system, that's a biochemical reaction, and that's a kind of activity of the body. In the way that he talks about sound, I thought there was quite a modern definition of sound, where there's like this something reacting with the body, and the sound is a product of that reaction. So I'm thinking perhaps this soul is this first order level of emergence that describes the interaction of the parts of the body, and then the thoughts are obviously not a chemical process or a biological process in that sense, but somehow must be a process that is parasitic on that biological process, or in other words, a form of a form. In fact, if my understanding of form is appropriate there, I don't know if it is.
Well, I think thinking of the soul as something that's emergent is going to be a problem. Just because the soul is meant to have this causal role, and emergent properties, I think, are generally non-causal.
Well, I don't mean epiphenomenal properties. I mean, like wetness of water can cause a tissue to be wet. You know, I don't mind speaking in terms of what I mean is that, like, for example, he thinks of matter as a constituent part of something, right? Rather than physical stuff, he means the parts of it. That's my understanding. So, like, the brick of a house is its bricks, but then the house has a form in virtue of not being merely an assemblage of bricks, but being a particular assemblage of bricks in a particular way. And that, what I think that he means by form there, to my modern mind, is the properties something has in virtue of being the particular assemblage of matter that it has.
I think this is to do with essences as well. Like, is this what you would describe as an essence? Like I had a note on this of, like, he thinks of essence as something that thing can't. If that thing loses that, it loses its identity, like as a house. So it's like the basic fundamental thisness of the thing. So I guess so does he think of the soul as the, like, thisness of humans or of animated things? I guess, is that kind of what you're getting at?
It'd be actually a good ad for Herbal Essences shampoo. Your hair is gonna lose its form without its essence. You never this particular structure that is your hair, the way you
your hair is going to lose what makes it hair.
If I'm not mistaken, early in De Anima, he makes the distinction, or he tries to outline the difference between form and matter. And the matter is what you have before there is this. So I can't say this pot, or if I just have a bunch of clay. Oh no, that's even simple.
No, the matter can be thises on their own. So I think it's kind of relative to levels of explanation. So the bricks can be thises in their own right, and have a relationship to their matter. But you know, we're talking about, so when we choose a matter, you know, a matter-form combination, it has to be the right combination. It's not like the atoms are the matter.
Correct.
For the house, because that's not what the workers are working on. In the same way, it's not earth, air, fire, and water that are the matter for the soul. It's the actual organism. It's the organized body. Whose matter might be earth and air and fire and water. Right,
but so when I point to the organization, when I point to this person or a person, there is a kind of, in order to be that specific, I have to say there has to be a form for me to point to a this. There has to be something above or
right.
shaping it.
Well, and because...
Jumping in correctly, by the way, Rebecca.
No, I mean, in some ways, because there's a this to point to, there's probably already form.
Correct.
Unless the form, you know, in the case of a living thing, it's a dead thing, and then in some sense, it's not actually being that thing, but you can still, in a dead thing, see that it was once a living thing because the form organized it to be that thing. So, I mean, it's hard to think about form and matter without going to these artistic examples, but of course those aren't natural compounds, right? And what we're interested in here is things that actually by nature are compounds of form and matter. So there's no outside person, the artist, the maker, who comes in and says, here's the idea, here's the form, now I'm going to build it. according to the idea I have. In natural things and in living things, it's actually the soul, which is the form of the living body, at work in the living body from its very inception, that turns it into the kind of body that works for that living being. So it has to have, it gets its soul from a living being just like it. So if it's going to be, you know, a salmon, it gets from the, according to Aristotle, the father salmon, a soul in the process of generation. And from the very moment of inception, its own soul starts to develop it in such a way that its organs, its shape, everything else about it develops to be a salmon and to do the things a salmon does.
Right.
Those delicious things a salmon does.
And not to get too outside Aristotle, but this sounds very similar to like Stoic use of nous, of like the organizing principle. I don't know what exactly how it's translated in Aristotle, like the soul or nous.
Well, soul. So yeah, nous is going to be different from soul.
Suke.
Yeah. So, but is it some sort of principle? Is it actually defined as that, or?
Absolutely. He says very clearly that the soul is the cause and, I mean, something like principle. Arche kai eidios. It's the, sorry.
Yes.
I know there was some discussion about whether we should use Greek or not, so I will try not to do that. But,
well,
you know.
Arche is sort of like originating point.
The principle.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it can be translated principle or beginning or, yeah. So those two are the...
So, like, I always thought of the Stoic idea as like a blueprint, like a seed. And I think that's one example they give is like there's a oak tree or something, and there's like the seed of the oak tree as the blueprint for the next oak tree, and like, so maybe that's an easy way to think of this.
Good opportunity for us to plug the Seneca show.
But so is it localized in time or extended across time? I mean, in other words, like he doesn't. It's not attributing some piece of matter to the soul, right? So soul is some kind of non-material or process or function or property, whatever it is. But he doesn't want to call it a particular piece of stuff. So is that
correct?
Thing tending towards a direction, or is it? I mean, for example, if I like put a little dust in a cloud, I suddenly get a much bigger cloud, right? So you can say there's like a nucleation point, right? At the point of nucleation for a cloud, there's the entire future of the cloud, but only in potential, not actual, right? So I don't see. In other words, I'm still thinking about this in terms of like just a cascade of emergent properties. Like you begin somewhere and bang, the whole thing goes. But I don't really see anything convincing me yet that there's anything that we should be speaking in terms of soul as though it's something over and above the natural functioning of bodies and so on.
Well, he has a passage where he argues. I didn't get to the point where I saw he came to a conclusion, but he has a point where he's discussing like how many. It seems like there's so many things that can only you can't separate the action of the soul from the body. So I don't know that he finds anything maybe but this idea of like the one thing that can go on if the body dies. I think that's the only thing he might find as like some sort of like mental property. Like most of the soul, though, I think that he thinks is actually tied to the biological like mass.
Yeah, but when I look at when he talks about the governing principle of a life, its form, it's more than just its atia. It's more than just its starting point and then a possible branching series of events that might grow out of it. That I don't think is there. You have to get this sense as this extension through time and these changes in place. There's a wholeness that or a shape that ties it all together, be it as this thing changes in place or changes in time. So that's the weird thing about trying to understand this Aristotelian intellect. It's a wholeness.
The movement thing, or.
Well, what struck me recently, I was in the National Portrait Gallery yesterday looking at a Rubens painting where all the people in the frame were about to fall out of the frame, if you like. So they're all sort of in motion but still, and I had the sense of the soul being something, or even just something like the soul being something like a potential motion just about to happen, but inevitable because of the way everything's running anyway. It's like a train track running downhill or something falling. I just saw this picture of this painting where everyone's just about to fall, and
Right.
it isn't like a Humean conceptual possibility X, Y, and Z. No, it's inevitable due to the way that everything is constituted. But it seems like
So,
because it's constituted that way rather than just hypothetically.
so it sounds like we're trying to make sense of the soul as a final cause versus the way we might explain things in terms of
A starting point or a genesis point.
mechanistic causes these days. I mean, I don't know, Rebecca. Do you have anything to say to that? I might give a very bad explanation.
No, I mean, I think that sounds right. I was trying to sort out this, persistence through time, but that makes sense. I mean, I think of it this way. It is true, as I said before, that the soul is the thing that, from generation, sort of produces the matter that it needs to be the kind of thing it's going to be. But the soul is also the thing that preserves that thing throughout its life as what it is. And he actually will use that term more than once to sort of preserve, sozusagen, what the thing is and allow it to engage in the world but not be destroyed or changed or altered fundamentally by the world. So that, eating is one way in which a living being preserves itself as what it is throughout its life.
Right.
Or destroys itself, by the way. If you eat.
Yeah.
Sometimes the soul, too much soul food can actually hurt you.
Yeah, I've been trying to lose some soul. It's not easy. Well, I was thinking of final causes in the sense that we're thinking of the way in which the organism is mapped out and proceeds according to plan. Let's put it that way. It proceeds according to plan in its generation and its growth and in its the work it does to be what it is. Including the after it eats, incorporating the food into its body and so on and so forth. And if we're comfortable with teleology or final causes, these days in the realm of human intention, right? So if we understand the planning part is very clear. If we have a house and if we have builders created architectural plans for the house and then they execute those plans, we can think of the house as being that for the sake of which the building was taking place. Let's put it that way. But it's a little bit more difficult when we're thinking of the organism or the. We're getting a lot of noise.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah. So when we're thinking about the form as the that for the sake of which is almost as if it were something analogous to an intention, a map in that sense. So these days we would want to say, yeah, well, there is a plan that's in the DNA and it's in but we can reduce it to these, mechanical kind of explanations. Or I hesitate to say efficient because Aristotle has his own conception of efficient causality, which differs from ours. So, but yeah, so that's the for me that's the difficult part of understanding the sense in which the soul is the final cause, because I think on one level we agree. We think of organisms as happening according to a plan, but we also have a contemporary scientific explanation for that that's reductive, and so I haven't read enough about this to say much more than that about that issue. But
all I would say is that I don't think. I wonder how much metaphysics we really need to ladle onto these concepts, because if I look around and I see a bed or a table or a person or whatever it may be, I'm not seeing sort of things randomly popping in and out of reality. It doesn't suddenly turn into an elephant, right? There are certain set of things about the way the world is that keep it being a table or keep it being a human being. And if we just attach a label to those set of things, even if they're not singular, but if we attach a label to them and say, well, there is something altogether to which causes the table to continue, then I don't think there's anything mysterious about that. There is surely something like that, whatever era of science we're in, whether we say that's X, Y, Z, or anything else.
Yeah, like I wonder if there's something about he doesn't seem to explicitly state it, but something about persistent like identity. Like I don't know how this would fit exactly into teleology, but he keeps using that example of like seeing Cleon's son and like what is it like knowing that it's him, or so. Were this not so, we would be able to perceive them only incidentally, in the way that we perceive not that Cleon's son is Cleon's son, but that he is a white man to whom it is incidental to be Cleon's son.
Where are you reading? Sorry.
This is 3:1. Let's see. I'm not good with these line numbers, but just above 425b on 3:1. Just at the top of the page.
Yeah. I mean, persistent identity, it makes sense to me, but I would also say, but not necessarily particular identity when you think of form.
Right.
So that I think it's right. Persist is the word, that I find attractive. I mean, insofar as things have a form, they have a persistent identity. Living things are able to work to maintain that persistent identity, and that persistent identity could be described as it's what they were made for, it's why they were made in this way, and it's their form and final cause. But I don't think that necessarily means their particular identity, because ultimately the form of Cleon's son is rational animal.
Right. Right. Like here, I guess he's more. This example is really meant to be that we can like perceive and pick out that this person we see is Cleon's son, and not just any person that looks like him. But yeah.
But at the level of sense perception, there's a whole series of things that help me to identify, that he's pale, that he's moving towards me, things like that. But at the level of nous, I'm not knowing Cleon's son. I'm knowing rational animal. That's what I'm getting at when I apply that intellectual capacity to him, to what I get. And when I do that, though, I'm getting it form.
Right. You're recognizing a universal category, perhaps.
It does sound like a conversation you'd hear in a black neighborhood. Is that Cleon's son over there? Is that I thought that was coming back from the coffee bean and teleology. It's a new name. I don't know if you guys have coffee beans.
So how universal are souls then? I mean, I guess I took them as to be quite particular things, like my soul.
Right.
So
yeah, like what's the significance of my soul surviving my death or whatever, if all souls are just sort of, human souls?
Well, I mean, that doesn't mean it's not significant
the reason
you.
I'm asking the question is...
Right. It's objectively significant, right? It's not, or it's subjectively significant, rather. It's not significant in the greater scheme of things. It's significant to the person who bears the soul, correct?
That you, whatever the you is, I don't know if he would characterize it like that, would exist.
The experiencer is who's housing the soul, who's embodying the soul. It's therefore significant to them. What makes anything really more significant than anything else is that it's within your reality. It's in your It's in your reach, within your touch.
Well, let's go back to whether or not a soul is universal or particular, because that's I think a difficult question, and there's a sense, right, in which it's both. So it's it is Michael Burgess's soul, but it's there's no distinction between your soul and there is a particular form to you, but when we talk about that form, we're talking about rational animal, and it applies to both of us. I mean, we would be going farther to talk about it's a this, and it's in the world, but and there's a long scholarly debate on what it means to say there are particular forms in the world, and yet they are, in a sense, universals. But Rebecca, did you want to? I thought you wanted to jump on that. So
He's having connection problems, it says. Rebecca is having connection problems.
Oh, really?
Well, I might just.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just went on the wireless. I was trying not to use the wireless, but now I'm
Okay.
on it, and maybe
All right.
it will be better. So I missed a bit of that, but I think that you were getting at the difference between, say, a universal soul and an individual soul. And actually, I mean, what's interesting here is it's matter. Matter is actually particularizing, so that it's the fact that it's in this body that it makes it my soul, and that it was in this body and it formed this body and it allows this body to get through every day and work towards this my final goal, which is my final end, which is being a rational human being and living well. So matter is the particularizing element that distinguishes between my soul, your soul. I mean, they are different. They're different because they're in different beings. But essentially, what I'm able to know of soul, and when I want to think about soul, I'm thinking of a universal. What is it I can say about soul? And he actually says this, right? In general. Not your soul, not my dog's soul, but if I want to talk about soul in a general way, what kinds of things am I able to know about it? And then, in some ways, that's why he quickly kind of says, well, we're not going to talk too much about matter. We're not going to talk too much about the material, because that is that's the localization of particularity, of identity.
Right. And I have a pretty old edition. I have the Genlin up here too, but I have a pretty old edition that's like talking about like breaking from pre-Socratics who are more clearly talking about, like everything's made of water, everything's made of air. That it's still kind of like in the sort of in the discourse that the soul is probably in a place, like it's located. So maybe it's kind of like saying, like, to him, it's like saying, like, well, it doesn't really matter if I say, like, my heart as an organ or your heart as an organ. Let's talk about all hearts as organs, and we'll know something about it. Because he doesn't, like, he thinks of it as he is kind of thinking of it to an extent as like an object that's in people, even if it's not.
Yeah.
Well,
I
like,
mean,
maybe that's up in the air, but.
I mean, I think that's a really important thing to think about. Is it an object? I mean, I'm not comfortable, and this came up on the program, the use of the word object, and it's actually shown mostly in Greek as a substantive or with this econ ending, things like that. So, but I mean, what kind of substance does the soul have, or what kind of substance is the soul, would be a sort of properly Aristotelian question, right? And he says at the beginning of book 2, if we want to think about substances, the ones that appear most to be substances are, bodies, natural living things. And then he breaks that down and he says, so we could say that there's matter, we could say that there's form, or we could say that there's the compound of matter and form. And in some ways, that's the substance, is the living compound. And when we separate matter and form, I tend to think of that as a distinction in thought or a distinction in speech that we're able to make, and that doesn't mean it's meaningless, but it also doesn't mean that there's something there that I can point directly to and say, there's the foot and there's the soul.
Right. So, like, it can only exist as that compound, even if we can abstractly think about it as being. So maybe somebody's saying, oh, you guys thought this, and I understand why you might have thought that, but really it's this compound thing.
And those things that you can only have, in a way, in thought, are real for Aristotle. They have being, but they don't have the same kind of being as the things we experience in the world through perception. It doesn't mean that they're not real, but they're not real in the same way.
Right.
So if a substance is the unity of form and matter, then a form cannot have a substance because that would be incoherent. So it's incoherent to ask what the substance of soul is, because that's asking what's the substance of something that's pre-required to have in order to have a substance, right? So the souls are not something substantive, if that's the definition of substance. Now, I'm still not seeing. I mean, to me, he's talking about animation, right? He's talking about what gives life its movement, in other words. And I think I think even the word soul to me is so radically like misdirecting. It feels to me like we're talking about the things that are in possession of something like a substance, when they're more like in possession of a motive force. I mean, it seems a little bizarre to say the rock's in possession of falling, and the fall it makes it does something. So we wouldn't want to reify falling like that, even if we're speaking in Aristotelian terms. So I'd be hesitant to reify the soul even so much as to be led down the question of what substance is the soul. Well, the body is the matter of that becomes unified with the soul to become a substance.
Well, is soul is an anachronism too, right? Like, what is? I know there is apparently sort of like a no-no on Greek terms, but like, what is the? What did he understand? Because it's not. He didn't use the word soul. It's a translation, right? So I'm not sure though. What is it? Psyche?
Suke.
Suke?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that struck me a lot that I really enjoyed thinking about was a moment in the podcast where you talked about rocks falling and sort of fire rising, and then life having like its own decision about how it moves. And I was thinking about that. I thought, well, kind of mitosis and meiosis are like a sort of kind of growth, and people aiming in directions is a certain kind of motion, and these kind of collections of motions are certainly not simple applications of gravity or electromagnetism or chemical reaction or anything like that. They're very complex, higher order reactions, if you like, just taking a purely physical view. So I can kind of see that there is something in common of the motion of all living things that is not simply reducible to gravity or levity or anything like that. And it seems to me that that's the kind of thing he's talking about, like, let's explain that motion, or let's try and understand that motion. I mean, am I incorrect?
Well, I think he's thinking there about the distinction between natural bodies and non-natural bodies, where natural bodies have their source of motion within them, and so I think it's closely tied to function as well. So for instance, an axe. For an axe to be an axe, it has to be used by someone who imparts the motion to that body, and that's the sense. And of course, there's a sense in which it's a natural body; it's made of wood and metal. But the sense in which it's an axe is entirely non-natural, and the motion comes from outside of it. So a rock falling is a natural body; it has an internal source of motion in itself. Let's say so.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, in fact, his definition of nature is having a source of motion in itself. Right. And all that distinguishes between, as you were saying, is natural and non-natural. And non-natural would be things that are made. And natural is pretty much everything else. The next distinction is kind of what this book is dealing with, which is, okay, so among natural things, some of them seem capable of moving themselves in particular ways, so that the rock is not a living thing because its source of motion is determined entirely by its material. It is earthen, it goes down. And in fact, the elements themselves have this inclination to go to their proper place, and that's what determines the movement of the rock. But for Aristotle, living things, and I think someone was getting very close to this, a way to think about suke might be self-motion, self-movers. But we have to think then about what he means by motion, because it's not locomotion all the time. So that to be ensukos, to be, ensouled, it would be a pretty literal way of thinking about that, is to have a principle of self-motion that in some ways allows you to resist, alter, stop, or begin in ways that are not completely determined by your matter and by the material motions that would otherwise drive our body even.
Huh. So interesting. So maybe that's why he never gets into the particulars of a particular person's identity or something. It's just that this allows you to have an identity because you can resist being pushed or pulled this way or that way, right?
That would make sense.
See, that's something I was trying to get to, but I would prefer to say something like this: the soul is the having of self-determined motion or something along those lines. It's not, if you like, the cause of that. It's what it is to have that. Does that make sense?
Well, I think for Aristotle, those two things, he is going to want to call it a cause.
Okay, then I need to be more. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to map this language down.
Sure.
Too much. But what I mean to say is
cause in our sense, or yeah. Okay.
Yeah, cause in the modern sense. What I would say is that I think the having of a soul is equivalent to the having of a self-directed motion. Now, whether that equivalence is a certain category of cause is, a more academic question about what he thinks. But in technical terms, there's just an equivalence between having a soul and that being the case. So it isn't as something. It isn't as though there's something prior to or later than. It's just that's what he's talking about. So I'm still trying to hold on to the idea that. See, the way I'm thinking about this, to be very clear, is that I can understand that simple objects follow simple forces and complex objects follow more complicated forces. But there is a certain kind of complexity, that is to say, human being or life in general, that is not simply deterministic in that way, but has a self-reflective stage to it. Even if it's a plant, there is a certain stage in which, like, it turns towards the sun, or it takes nutrients in, or whatever it may be. That isn't just a cascade of simple events. There's a certain kind of stage in that process of living where the motion becomes complex, and for me, that's just to do with how things interact. But for Aristotle, I think that's what he is trying to get at with the soul. He's trying to get at there are certain living things that have a relationship to their input and to their output that is, in some sense, what I would call reflective or self-directed. Does that make sense?
Well, maybe that's the rational distinction, where, although that's very, seems like language-based, the rational one. I don't know if we want to, is this talk about, like, imagination, even? Do we want to maybe get into that? Into his sort of different levels of mind? Like, it's not, there are several different levels of mind that he talks about, right? Like the imagination, the nous itself.
I guess I'd want to know, I mean, when we use the word mind, do we mean nous? Because then we're really talking about a few chapters in book 3. Or do we mean, sense perception? I guess I'm wondering if it's. I mean, I apologize. I don't mean to be dogmatic about it, but they mentioned in the podcast that some people have been reading the Nussbaum and Rorty volume,
Yep.
which is a wonderful book of scholarship, and I very much appreciate it. And it opens with this really polemic essay.
The Burn Yacht?
Yes.
Yeah, I that was the one essay I thought was, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, he really ignited a bit of a firestorm with that. But I mean, he says an Aristotelian philosophy of mind is no longer credible because we just don't accept Aristotelian physics. And my reaction to that, and I don't think I'm alone in this, is, well, why are we talking about an Aristotelian philosophy of mind? I don't think Aristotle thought at all that's what he was doing, was giving us a philosophy of mind in any kind of modern, contemporary sense of that terminology. I mean, he's giving us a philosophy of living beings. So I always think it's really helpful to keep the question in mind, or the questions in mind, and make sure that, I mean, I don't mean to criticize, but if we mean nous, mind might be fair. I'd be inclined to say intellect, probably, but mind is a loaded word for us, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, like this edition I have too says it actually opens with something like, be careful with people who are adapting Aristotle, who are like modernizing
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle, because it is in a sense like it's ancient philosophy. Like it might not be necessarily, uh, it's like modernizing Aristotle to the point where you're not telling people what Aristotle was trying to say.
Right, and I think. Sorry, I'm not interrupting, am I?
No.
No,
Okay,
go.
so I mean, I think it's almost as if we want to consistently ask Aristotle this question. Well, what's your answer to the mind-body problem? Right?
Hmm.
There was no mind-body problem for Aristotle, and in some ways, he makes that clear when he says, we should just as soon ask, how the imprint is in the wax. Like they're fundamentally joined. And he says a few things that help us understand, how we could take him up if we want to answer that question. It's not in the body like a sailor is in the boat. That's not how it works. But
Right.
it's this fundamental connection that is only separable in thought and speech. What we experience, what the world is filled with, is ensouled living bodies. And so the mind-body problem, I think, begins from saying, well, there are clearly bodies, and there are clearly things that aren't bodies, and we might call them minds or souls, or, how do they possibly work together? But look at the world around you. It's filled with things that are working quite well together, if we even could say together anymore, because what it's filled with are things that are fundamentally one and functioning in a particular way as a lived body, not things that are sort of like, well, how's my soul controlling this motion right now, right?
Mm.
Yeah, I mean that's why I wanted to emphasize the is of the identity I was trying to make earlier of the self motion is having a soul, or in other words, it doesn't seem quite right to say the soul is doing this. Doing this is the soul. That's what it is to do something. And this later modern idea that there are two separate objects, there's the mental object and there's the physical object, or there's the mental process and there's the physical process, and they align by accident or by who knows what. No. They're the same process. Is that just one description of it, and this is just another description of it? That seems to be right. That seems to be right.
Yeah, and I mean, Wes brought up early this term hylomorphism. The soul and body are a particular. That's not Aristotle's term. That's what we call it. But it's really hard to think about these things without as I think the show kept running up against this problem, without thinking about the form matter relationship and the potency actuality relationship. You have to kind of situate all of this against those or with those, because those are these fundamental relationships for Aristotle that we, when we try to think about things, we separate and we talk about them this way and that way. But fundamentally what we find are, matter with form already acting in it or acting with it, or it's hard to talk about that kind of fundamental unity that he has in mind there. Oh, as soon as you bring up potency and actuality, everybody gets quiet.
Yeah, I mean,
no,
you want to help
I don't want to talk
situate
about
us, or because
what I liked was the separation out of sensation away from what we consider more mental faculties. Cause that's something I'm beginning to think is right. That if you like, we're sort of what we consider mental faculties are more like spectators on a sensing process that we have little control over, as we would think about it in sort of later modern terms, as though like an image is happening inside a container, and then we have this mental object that's inside a container that is our mind. It seems like Aristotle's idea is more that there's sort of a reaction that our body's participating in with the world, and with the higher orders of the intellect are just sort of spectators on that reaction. They are trying to understand it, generalize it, explain it in terms of cause and so on. But that sort of reaction, or that sound, or the light, or whatever it may be, is just something that these higher mental powers are there observing, rather than either generating or participating or anything like that. So it's almost sort of like radically anti-Kantian. the higher orders of the intellect are just there observing the stage of the world hitting us, if you like. Something
It's much more complex, isn't it, than just like a mind and a body? Like, it's not just like there's a little homunculus who
Yeah.
gets pictures and stuff. It's like he categorizes everything. Like, yeah, there's these senses and they have these different interactions with things, and then you have these different levels of. Again, it's hard to talk about without putting too much bias into it. Whatever we want to call like nous or this like mental faculty. Like that was more like what I was interested in, is like how he actually does. He seems to also subdivide this mental faculty into different terms. I'm just looking at some here, like passive intellect, active intellect. I'm a bit unclear on those distinctions.
You're not alone.
Yes. Vermeer's poeticos is great. Yeah.
It seemed to me like there were certain things that, like, and I might be confusing this for something else there, but it seemed like there were certain things that within the intellect exist, right? Which would be considered the passive intellect. Is that right, Rebecca? Like, there are certain things that Aristotle seems. Here's the dog. Come to visit.
I mean, yeah, I this chapter, I mean, it's the shortest chapter, right? We're talking about 3.5. It's tiny. It's unbelievably dense. It's and I mean, I don't think from the beginning, commentators have not quite known what to do with this. So even his earliest Greek commentators sort of were like, well, he must be thinking here about something like what he raises at the end of the Metaphysics, that he raises in even Nicomachean Ethics 10.7, contemplative intellect is something divine, or is our participation in the divine. And that really got captured in some ways by his Arabic and Christian commentators, Thomas Aquinas probably most famously. But I kind of all that. And so this is one reason why I'm not a good expert. Because I don't agree that it would be so odd to me if he wanted to say, all this time I've been telling you how fundamentally connected the body and soul are. And in fact, all those definitions of the soul at the beginning of 2 have to do with its role in the body. And there he's a little bit cagey, right? If there is some separable part. And then we get to 3.5 and it starts to sound like he's saying, oh, there is a separable part and it's active intellect. And what does active intellect do? It kind of provides things for the passive intellect, which then, becomes the form of whatever the active intellect is providing. And I kind of want to resist that. But that's complicated. I'm probably wrong. But my reading of it would be something like this. And this is why I think it's really important to think about sensation and what actually is happening for Aristotle, because I think, and he says this more than once, that contemplation actually is a bit like sensation, and quite a bit like sensation, insofar as the intellect has to be empty, right, of anything. Otherwise, it couldn't be completely receptive. And that's a really important notion for him, that the intellect is fundamentally receptive to the forms of everything else. So what does he mean by that? I mean, that's really, that's what 3.5 is probably getting at. And I think it means, I guess, something like this. Things have forms, but the forms are in them. They're at work in them all the time. And I have a capacity to think about what is really at work in something. And in some ways, that capacity has to be completely open so that I can experience the whole world and think about anything I encounter and have access to it in terms of what it is, not just, that it's red and tall and fast or something like that, but what is it? I kind of think right now, in this moment, that the active intellect is the forms of things insofar as I can then be receptive to them. I don't think he has this incredibly robust concept of, God's intellect informing mine, and that's why I'm a thinking thing. I just don't see it there.
Right. Because much of his other work is mechanical. It's very mechanical. It's how they fit together.
Well, Rebecca, I'm still not convinced that you're not an expert after that. I was very excited. I thought for sure you were going to prove yourself to be an amateur. And
let's just say you're not an expert substantive, but you are expert adjectively. You're expert in your explanations.
Well, I don't know. If you have bloggers who comment, you'll get comments on that interpretation.
Yes.
But
how dare you?
They say, Rebecca, that the great leaders never wanted to lead. They say that about Moses.
Yeah. Well, they say they have to drag them back down into the cave, right?
Yep. You've been dragged down for this conversation.
Well, my office is a bit of a cave, so. Well, and I don't agree with that at all. I actually think, anybody who wants to sit down and read this text is precisely the person I want to talk to about this text. So it's not, it's not the people who get together once a year to prove each other wrong about this text.
I'll leave.
I'm sticking around.
No, I have to agree with the last thing you said, though. It seems he goes to an awfully long way of associating the body with the soul, and in saying that, he doesn't say at one point that a dead body is not a body or something along those lines.
It's not a human being, or it wouldn't be whatever it was.
Precisely. So, there seems to be a very naturalistic worldview behind his whole methodology. Now, of course, when death comes into the play, a lot of people just put a little catch in their whole naturalistic worldview and go, oh, I'm naturalistic. Oh, it turns out at the very end there's a little bit of non-naturalism there. That's very common in philosophy. So, and I don't think Aristotle's above it. But it does seem strange to cram it into a small bit at the very end.
It is very small, too. I didn't realize how small that is.
And that's why, I really think sensation is where it's at for Aristotle. I think that's what, in some ways that we all do that, and he's very clear, right? At the very end of the book, which all the original show participants said, what a disappointment. The end of the book. But because he comes back. Yeah, he did. But he comes back and he says something like, well, and this is why, you have to have touch in order for the animal to live. Otherwise, you take away the sense of touch, the animal necessarily dies. I think that's the perfect ending because I think that's what this book is about. Plants are interesting to Aristotle in a limited way. I think what it is to be an animal and the ways in which human beings might just slightly surpass that is what I think this book is about.
Well, and it seems like there you were saying almost as an evolution, there's a big proto-evolutionary explanation of why animals have different faculties. Their drive to their ability to survive, or in general terms, determines what faculties they have because they require those in order to survive and so on. So whether it's correct in exactly those terms, that's still the form of an evolutionary explanation, where you say they're in position of this sensation in order to be able to do these kinds of things.
Right. It lives in air or water, so it ought to be able to sense through air or water. Something like that.
Which ties it to its life and so on. So that's a proto-evolutionary explanation, and presumably a lot of people will just sort of mystify why anything should have anything, really. But to continue to exist, to be what you are, you have to have these sort of set of senses, otherwise you won't be what you are. That seems proto-evolutionary.
Okay.
So am I allowed to ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, why not?
I'm this is a bit of a departure, maybe. I heard somebody mention the Genlin a commentary.
Yeah. What do you? What's your opinion on that?
Sorry, I missed that.
So I was just saying, yes, we did. I asked what your opinion on that commentary is, but I found it useful. Just but
It
Well,
was linked on
actually,
the show page, yeah.
yeah. I took a look at it. I had never seen or heard of it before. So I did take a look at it. I actually have a general question about commentary and reading Aristotle. So do you typically read commentaries on this show when you read a
we
thinker?
typically don't. I mean, it depends. So depends on how much time we have, but um, I found that for De Anima, I felt like I had to read other things to be well prepared enough within the 2 weeks I had to say something on a show about it. But I went to St. John's and I understand the St. John's, and generally it's the sort of what we do. We'll read the text and we'll discuss the text and not try to bring so much outside commentary to it. But in this case, at least I tried to read some of those materials.
Yeah, I mean, I also somebody had read the entire book. Was that you of
Yeah.
Misnomer? That I mean, as I said, I think those are great essays. It's actually commentary that I have. I mean, I've read commentaries, and I think at times you have to. But I guess I thought it was sort of interesting that the whole time there was a lot of reference to the commentary, and I guess I wondered if that's something that would typically be done, or if that's Aristotle in
No, that
particular.
was no. It's not typical.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I on the so we did the first. So we did 2 recordings for this, and the first one, I I didn't feel like I had or that we did a great job with it. So so for the second recording, I read a lot more for that recording, and then the references to the commentary, so ideally we would, even if we do background preparation, we don't make the conversation about that preparation, and it's very rare. So it's a function of sort of the breakdown in the face of a very difficult text of the whole process. So that's really what happens. But normally, even if we did a lot of secondary reading, it would kind of inform our conversation, but we wouldn't be focused on that in the way that we became focused on that in this podcast. So.
If I might say, it strikes me a bit like reading the Bible or something. I mean, I am personally quite critical of people who try to read the Bible without a commentary or anything like it, and so it's like cloud watching. You see patterns in words that happen to be translated in English, and you think you have a sense of what they mean, but you really don't. And
So
it
I
strikes
mean,
me.
yeah, I mean there are two. So I have 2 different experiences of this. One was going to St. John's College, where the sort of the culture there is you don't read any secondary literature and you confront the text, and there's an enormous value in that. So I read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and that's actually sort of the thing which really turned me on to philosophy, weirdly enough. But I spent a lot of time, deciphering it for myself, and there's an enormous value in that, and I felt like I really grasped it in a way, Then I went to grad school, and there's a sense in which there's a lot of, there's so much secondary literature out there, and it is a shortcut. I mean, I would have spent a lot less time trying to figure Kant out if if I'd had some of this secondary literature available. Now I think, so on the other hand, it becomes a crutch. It becomes a way of not thinking about the text. And so there really is, if you have the time and you're not doing a podcast where you just have a little bit of time to prepare, really just beginning by reading the text and thinking, and struggling over it, I think is ideal. But
by the way, that's also a distinction you can make between Kant and the Bible. For instance, if you read the Bible without the commentaries, you're reading an entirely different story than you're getting with the commentaries.
Yeah, well, it does seem like a very Protestant ethic of the Kant itself or the Aristotle itself or something. It seems to me just totally bizarre. I mean, I don't.
Well, in a way, because you have to. It's a different. You have to. You know, it's a difference between to bring it back to Aristotle, active and passive. So, active intellect and passive intellect. It's if you have to reverse engineer Kant and try and you almost have to rethink all of that stuff versus being told, hey, this is what all of this means, and here's all the background, and even here's the conversation. And believe me, I understand it's a deficit because I've done it. There's an enormous deficit to suddenly picking up the critique of pure reason and not even knowing the full historical dialogue. At St. John's, I'd read plenty of philosophy, but not knowing the particular dialogue that Kant himself was entering into and coming to that cold. Yes, there's a lot of disadvantages to that, but the advantage is sort of the amount of, let's say, activity it requires in the reader. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't mean to be critical of that. Certainly, for me, it's
how dare you?
For me, it's Hegel.
Yeah.
I could not get through Hegel without commentary. But
So actually, Hegel, I think, after obsessing over Kant for so long, Hegel, in a way, is such a detailed blow-by-blow response to Kant, even though he's not explicit about it, that it's it made it a lot easier.
I'm hoping when I get to it here that will happen. But I mean, one thing is right that Aristotle does situate himself really nicely. In the first book, most of what he's doing is situating himself into the dialogue and the questions and problems that have been raised. So, there wasn't a lot of talk, and I'm not suggesting we need to have a lot of talk about it, but I think that's always something. Aristotle is really good in some ways about saying, here's what people have said about this, here's what's good about what they've said, here's where I think it probably needs to be revised or thought through in a different way. And almost all of his major treatises will begin with a little bit of review of, here's what people have said, here's what the materialists have said, here's what Plato said. So he is his own commentator some of the time. Sorry, I distracted the conversation.
No, this was
interesting.
Good.
I mean, yeah, he is. He strikes me as pretty modern a lot of the time in like the way he writes. Of like, everyone earlier at least seems to be very like, this is my idea, and he's like, let's review, like, Plato said this, and I think actually it's more like this, and like, I find that to be really modern. But also, I mean, what I'll often do is I'll read maybe a couple like intros, maybe not take them all at face value, but for me it helped a lot it saves you some time, right, of like, well, this is the opinion of someone who's been studying this for their entire career or something, so at least I know, although who knows, maybe that influenced so much of how I approached it in the first place. It's hard to know.
And I think it's... Go ahead, please.
Well, I was going to say it depends on the kind of activity you're engaged in. I mean, if you're trying to, I don't know, discipline yourself or beat yourself into the right shape according to some program, then sure, read the Critique of Pure Reason. I mean, I'm interested. I mean, I'm personally interested in what's right and what's right and what's wrong conceptually, and I would be like, ooh, it would terrify me to think that someone had the right idea about Kant, even though perhaps Wes you did, right? To think that they had the right idea of Kant from themselves reading page 1 to page 2000. It's like, any confidence you have that you're talking about should, there should be 0. There should be 1%, not high.
Well, that's not necessarily the best way to go through life doing anything. Going with 0 confidence in what you're.
Yeah, so I think
skeptics.
This is where a little grandiose faith in oneself can actually be useful. So the feeling, yes, I can understand Kant if I just try hard enough, is actually. And yes, you can read the Critique of Pure Reason, and you can.
Have your own ideas on it.
you can decipher it. It's not
Yeah, I
because
think
because all it requires is that you just simply start thinking about these things,
Right.
and once you start, you will begin to find your way down some of the same paths that that Kant ended up traveling, and you will have done it.
You've done it.
In a sense, by yourself, as maybe as a toddler, but you will be standing on your own to some extent.
It's a good first run, I guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then and then you start reading commentaries like I did, and thinking, no, this person doesn't understand Kant.
Just imagine,
I'm pro expert.
I'm just imagining Michael like Chris Farley looking through the stupid. That's not what he means, idiot.
No, I'm pro expert. I'm pro. I don't know. You give a text 2,000 years and I don't know 3,000 of some human lives, and you get more out of that process than you do, a 20-year-old grad student or whatever it may be trying to write a paper.
Perhaps
I just think that one is a kind of positive exercise for a person to undergo as a sort of self-discipline, intellectual self-discipline. But I think that's what the exercise is. The exercise isn't uncovering what Kant said. The exercise is disciplining myself in order to read Kant, in order then to be able to do other things intellectually.
Perhaps.
I'm interested in what the
for
ideas,
instance, I think a lot of my ideas about Aristotle come out of what I've read about opinions. Like, he's obviously so influential in philosophy. Like, if you were to get all your information about Aristotle from what's the latest, you get a lot of like scholasticism, theology, and stuff like that. That I think I have a lot of like biases I don't even know about yet until I read it more closely. That, like, for instance, just even the fact that Aristotle, when you read him, like just read him, he's a lot more naturalistic than I would have been led to believe, I think, which is maybe a really good reason to approach something carte blanche. Obviously, you don't. For me, obviously, like maybe even at least a glossary, because the English translations of certain things, for instance, are a big thing. Like, I would be pretty lost if I didn't, use of the word God or mind or whatever is really tricky.
Yeah, I think the glossaries are probably pretty critical. And I mean, in some ways with Aristotle, maybe more than Plato, for example, because I think Aristotle wants us to stumble over some of his words and his usages. And if you're not reading it in Greek, you wouldn't know to stumble, unless those words are given to you in a bulky sort of way, and then you have to think, well, entelechia, what does he mean by that, right? I mean, that's not a word that was in use. That's a word that he coined, and we're meant to stumble over that. And if we don't have somebody telling us this is what this word is in Greek, and boy, is it weird, even in Greek, we wouldn't.
Right.
I don't
so
know.
He's actually formulating his own jargon that a contemporary reader would go, "Oh, that's interesting." That you would use, like, what's that?
Yeah, I mean, jargon. I suppose.
Not in a negative
No,
sense.
yeah. I mean, he wants us to pause and sort of say, entelechia. What do I mean by that? It's the way a thing holds itself in its end, and actively, yet not, sort of, I don't know, in a that it rests in its end or something like that. He wants us to stop there, I think.
Yeah, that's my only thought, is that maybe you run the risk sometimes of if you just read over it and you miss any nuance like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see what else we can move the conversation on. Here's some. Unless anybody else wants to say anything about that, maybe we're just taking a moment to think. But chime in, someone. Where are we at? What do people want to do?
Have we figured it out?
I killed the conversation. I'm sorry.
Why do you keep doing it?
We finished Anima.
You completed the conversation. You made the conversation reach its potential.
Maybe a question is,
Isn't that killing him?
What other points do we want to hit before we wrap the after show today? Does anyone else have any specific things that they wanted to bring up?
There were people who were quiet.
Surely people must have questions from the
Right.
leftover from the show, or
Right now.
Chase?
Chase?
I'm just taking it in. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah. Yeah, we can hear.
Okay.
I think one of the things I might say that I haven't said is I was thinking about the eye going red or something as this sort of sense thing. And I was thinking about the visual cortex, that there is a physical, or say representation that's already too late to modern philosophy, but there is a physical resemblance of some kind that exists in the makeup of the brain that matches up with what is being sensed.
You're talking about the spatial arrangement, right?
Yeah, but even the color. I mean, you can do an fMRI-ish of a person's brain and recover what it is they're looking at. So there is something in the physical makeup of the brain.
We lost you,
that
Michael.
in some way.
There.
Hello?
You just paused there. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just saying that there is there's a
There's
phrase.
a mapping relationship between brain states and.
Yeah, but even.
But it's not. I'm not sure
more direct than that.
resemblance is the right.
Yeah, there's a phrase that Degas, I don't know, who invented photography, said of photography. He said he's invented a way for nature to reproduce herself, and it struck me as there's that kind of thing going on, that there's a reproduction of the visual origin of objects in our brain physically, and that seems to be a lot like his theory of perception almost, that there is some kind of reaction that's happening to the body, and somehow the body is, in its reaction to that, capturing something about it. Does that make sense? So it struck me as a very potentially appealing theory of sensation, but I might just be reading a hell of a lot into it.
Well,
you're talking about the form. Go ahead, Rebecca. But we're talking about the form, the sense in which, the form that we can take on the form, let's say, of something outside of us. But go ahead, Rebecca.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, there's that's been read in different ways, and somebody mentioned there's this very literalist reading of that, where
Right.
there are people, Sarabji,
Yeah.
I think, is the primary one who has put this forth, but there's a lot of people who still think this is right, that there is some part of my eye that actually turns red when I sense something that is red. So when I look at the blue of the painting in front of me, the eye jelly turns blue, so there's a real mirroring. But then, of course, he says, right, that it takes on the sensible form without the material. So that's what that's trying to unpack, is what does it mean to take on the sensible form? And I think for Aristotle, it probably means, I mean, he says, in the way in which we are receptive to it. So it doesn't mean necessarily that some part of me becomes blue. It means that I become aware of blue. And how precisely I become aware of blue, I think probably has to do with what he says about the sense being a mean and being sort of in a state of neutrality with regard to the contraries with which to which it's susceptible, and that there are people who are proportionalists who think it takes on some sort of proportion. I think it's a really hard thing to sort out, and I'm not sure Aristotle gives us enough clarity to map it on to a really contemporary theory of mind, but I think he has something in mind, like there's a kind of abstraction. The material is not, I'm not taking the stone into my eye when I sense gray. And I'm certain, but I also don't think the eye is turning gray. I think I'm becoming aware of gray, and that for Aristotle that means something like I become gray in the way in which a sensor becomes gray, which is not the same as the way in which, say, the painting on the wall is gray.
Yeah, I mean, we can see these types of relationships in. So we could think of it as encoding, for instance. There doesn't always have to be a relationship of resemblance for one formal thing to have to do with another. So, for instance, if I record a record and I'm etching something into the surface of the record, that's a structured thing. That's formal, and there's some sense in which that form is an encoding of the structure of sound. Let's say the sound is formal, the surface of the record is a structure, it's formal, and there's some sort of relationship between those two things. So the record can, in some sense, receive the form of sound. That's the way I would, that may not be, it may be a little anachronistic.
Wes, is this kind of what you guys were referring to when you said perception is affected by thought object?
Or it's like thought. Yeah, in that way. I mean, I think that what it comes down to is a question of how am I affected by the blue, by the cold of the object, or the smell of the food. And in a typical relationship between natural objects, affection or being changed by something means to become like it. It means it's brought into contact with the thing, and it actually becomes what the other thing actually is. But sensation is not like that, right? When I can put my hand on my glass, and I know that doesn't work on the radio, but I am holding a glass right now, and I'm not becoming cold. I can feel the cold without being completely affected and changed by the cold, and that's important. That's important because that helps me persist as a living thing, not to be physically becoming everything I encounter. And that's sort of fundamentally what I think living things do, is they enact the things they encounter in an appropriate way without becoming the thing in the way that the thing is the thing. And I'm sorry, I
think that's really good. I think there's this sort of middle ground between if it'd be really interesting if perception were just a morphing ability where we just came into contact with something and became that thing, literally became that thing. And
that's my X-Men power.
Yes. And perception is an X-Men power light.
There was an X-Men called Morph.
Yes, right.
Mm-hmm.
So we become formally we can take on things without becoming morph, without changing our shapes and doing all of that stuff. So there's this weird middle ground where we could, it's what we often now think of today as representation. So we do want to, we like the picturing relationship because it gets at the sense in which it can be, something can be another thing without actually being that thing. The picture becomes a good metaphor for that, as many, despite the fact that it has so many drawbacks. But.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, Nick had wanted to talk about imagination a little, and I mean, maybe a sort of fundamental difference is that Aristotle thinks you can have sensation without necessarily having imagination, which might be a kind of representative ability, an ability to make representations. And I mean, we're not talking probably about a whole lot of animals that that don't have imagination. I think they're probably pretty low-level animals. I think he talks about larval worms there. But I think bees maybe do have imagination. So, I believe my dog has imagination. That's why, at 6 o'clock he knows it's dinner time.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, some way, but the larval worm, or the thing that doesn't even have the ability to represent a picture to itself, isn't altered when it encounters colder water, hotter, warmer water. When it brushes up against algae, it doesn't become soft and smooth. It stays what it is. And to be alive is to be able to relate and be in the world without becoming everything that you come across. And I mean, I guess that's why I think this text is...
If you have boundaries.
Yeah.
If not, require some therapy.
Yeah.
It's very biological. It's very like organism. This is the limit of the organism, and I mean, would you find it useful to even think of him as like a proto biologist.
I don't even think proto. He is a biologist. I mean, he's a scientist. He's a natural scientist, and that there was no distinction at that point between scientist and physicist and biologist and philosopher and literary critic or what he's
Right.
But I mean,
it was like L.A. Everybody had slash titles,
Yeah, he was waiting tables actually for a while. So I think that's Aristotle spent enormous amounts of time looking at living things. He dissected them. He has books, volumes of works on parts of animals, histories of animal, movement of animal, generation of animals. This is all very situated. This doesn't come from sitting in a basement room, reading someone else. This comes from being out there and doing this stuff. When he says, the first thing in an animal that is, a blooded animal that forms is the heart. He knows that because he knows at 36 hours you can see something pumping blood through a chick embryo. He knows that. He did that.
He also wrote,
and we do that at St. John's as well.
We do that. It's awesome.
One of the reasons I wanted to raise the sensation thing, one of the things I think of sometimes of a different model of sensation, which seems to be more close to apples, is something like a thermometer. If you put a thermometer in some hot water, then it's going to react and read some temperature or something. But it's not going to be. But that reading isn't anything like heat, nor is that reading anything like like anything involved in the situation. It means if you have 35 degrees centigrade or something, then that number or that height that it's translated between temperature and height, if you like, are completely different properties. The formal relationship between.
But it corresponds to.
It does,
Right.
but it corresponds to something in a way that I think early modern philosophy and later on, when they talk of representations, they're thinking of the mind as like a stage or a container in which there are objects, and like the apple object is a mental object that's different from a physical object. And I'm just thinking, well, no, just throw all that away. This is just a reaction that's happening to you, and it's not as though the table is anywhere else but in the world, and just through this reaction you become aware of it. It's not like it's inside a mind or it's this representation or anything. It's just this kind of brute reaction, like the thermometer rising in temperature that you're having with the world, and you just sort of become aware of it as that happens, which seems to me about right, which makes me suspicious that I'm reading too much.
Well, one thing, does the thermometer feel pleasure when it achieves certain temperatures? Because, Aristotle does think, right? I know it doesn't. I'm sorry. That was, the difference.
Where it is.
Oh, I have no response to that. Okay. For Aristotle, it is true. I think reaction is a way of thinking about this, but the reaction of a living thing, at least of an animal who can sense, is also going to involve almost always the appetitive faculty, pleasure, pain, desire. And so, and part of that comes from it would be an incomplete animal. He says this, if it can't move. And now I mean move by locomotion. If it can't move away from something causing pain or towards something giving it pleasure, it's actually in some ways not a full animal. And early somebody said something, that we don't want to talk about deficient forms, and in some ways he does think that's a little bit deficient. You're on your way to becoming a full animal. Yeah.
In your face, Wes. In your face.
When he talks about moles, I can't remember the passage right now. He says they even have eyes; they're covered up, right? But an animal that can't move away from what hurts it or towards what it wants. In some ways, then its perception is in vain, and nature doesn't really do anything in vain for Aristotle.
That's interesting.
It's deeper than that. It's not so shallow. It's not so vain.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a pretty good talk. I think we're we're kind of getting to the point where we wind down here. Does anybody have any other points or questions they'd like to bring up with either myself or Rebecca or Wes? Okay. No? Nobody?
I
Wes?
think we're done.
I think we're done. All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending today. It was nice to. It's been a long time since we've done this, and I've missed it. It's good to be back.
Thanks for hosting, Danny,
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
and thanks Rebecca for coming on. You were wonderful.
Oh, thanks. I really appreciate what you guys do here. I think it's so important to make this stuff accessible and that anybody can read this and listen and think about it and then get on and talk about it.
And it's always
Good.
great.
And by the way, Eva Brian has come on 2 of our shows, I think, if you're interested. So.
I saw that. I saw that. I like the little cartoon picture of her. I love that. I don't want one of me, but I love it of her.
Well, yeah. Hopefully, we'll be doing another one of these soon. I would hope, right, Wes? And I mean, you guys know better than I do, but I hope.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, I'm not sure how this happens. I get strong-armed into showing up for these. So.
Well, when you guys are ready to do the physics or the metaphysics, I don't want to be the expert, but I'd love to be part of the conversation.
I think the next time you should come on the next time we do Aristotle, you should be on the show.
I would like that very much. Thank you.
You will be coming on as an expert, whether you like it or not. I'm sorry. As long as you're here, we will be referring to Rebecca as an expert. Very nice having you conversation today. And I'm only kidding, Rebecca. You don't have to be an expert if you don't want.
Well, Thomas Aquinas took to just referring to Aristotle. Somebody mentioned this as the philosopher. And I always think, I don't know how he'd feel about that, but...
You feel great.
Mm-hmm.
I know him. He was a nice guy. He loved it when you stroked his ego. Fantastic.
Preferred it when you stroked his noose, though.
I think that's the line we gotta hand out.
Cool.
People say, "How was the episode?" They say, "Yeah, I learned at Aristotle. Loved it when you stroked his noose." Fantastic. How'd you find that out? They had an expert on their show.
Oh, God. Yeah, I'm going to put that on my CV.
Have a great week, everybody.
Okay, you too. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
This is awesome. Yep.
Okay.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.